Greetings, everybody, and welcome to this panel and public dialogue titled Speaking of Death. My name is Kobe Shantz. I'm a member of the program committee for the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, or CSRS, and an associate teaching professor in the School of Nursing and a registered nurse working in palliative and end-of-life care. I begin by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the land of Lekwungen peoples, the Saanich, Songhees, the Esquimalt people today, whose ancestors have gathered here for millennia to harvest and share food, to work and play, to celebrate and mourn, and to dialogue, I suppose, as we've gathered today, some of us in person and some via Zoom. I ask that wherever you're joining us from today, please take a moment to consider how historical relationships and commitments to reconcile may be honored in our ways of being this evening. Today's event is one of a weekly series of features featuring CSRS affiliates and guests, and which I believe is being taped. So it's available for those who can't attend today. Our topic, Speaking of Death, will be explored through panel and public discussion. And after we hear from panel members, Paul Bramadat, Director of CSRS, will moderate and let us all know how to participate in the public discussion. And before introducing panel members, I want to offer a bit of context and a few remarks about today's topic. Our focus follows in part from a panel and public discussion sponsored by CSRS in 2018 on medically assisted death. And we realized during that discussion that there were many more interests, topics, questions to explore in relation to death and dying, and that CSRS was an excellent venue for that exploration. It offers a venue to come together to share and study diverse views on matters relevant to religion and culture. And with regard to today's topic, in hindsight, we might well have added a question mark after the ... in the title. A question could convey some hesitancy, tentativeness about engaging in the topic in what some would describe as a death-denying or a death-defying society. It would convey our intent, that is to open and invite rather than require dialogue of each other. Despite popular campaigns and recommendations and other pressures to speak up, to complete advanced care plans, to be informed, to share emotions and experiences, we know it's not the way of everybody to speak publicly or perhaps at all about death. A question in our title would emphasize our shared curiosity and appreciation for hearing diverse views. For example, from one nursing perspective, speaking of death encompasses paradox. Speaking encompasses speaking and being silent, speaking and listening, speaking and bearing witness, showing as well as telling, not speaking at all. Death is living and dying all at once, unto and perhaps beyond medical pronouncements. Speaking of death is paradoxical in the way relationships with the topic and with the topic and with the people we were with is paradoxical, engaging with and leaving aside some ideas, choosing to convey only some thoughts, beliefs, values, hopes, fears amid the mystery of human universe. It involves experiencing an ever-shifting array of benefits, gifts, and burdens of speaking about death. Paradox in human experience is one among many diverse views we explore today, and we hope you leave intrigued and inspired to explore further. We're also aware that one can be surprised by tender memories and feelings and shifting certainties. Please reach out if you need to. And now to our panelists. With great appreciation for all you offer knowing you draw on significant personal and professional reflections and experiences relevant to our topic. So a brief introduction in order of speakers. Peter Scales is a Unitarian lay chaplain serving a small congregation in James Bay and also doing rites of passage for people with no religious connections. Peter's also a Unitarian chaplain at the university here at the University of Victoria and is educated as a historian and is chair of the CSRS Advisory Council. And then Deanna Hutchings is a registered nurse and palliative education consultant. Deanna holds a deep and abiding interest in palliative care nursing for the past 40 years through practice, education, research, and leadership in both Island Health and the University of Victoria. She's an affiliate consultant with the BC Centre for Palliative Care. She holds a baccalaureate and master's degrees in nursing from UVic and holds Canadian certification in hospice and palliative care nursing. And Misha Butot is a registered clinical social worker and counselor who works with Victoria Hospice Society on the Crisis Urgent Response Outreach Team. Welcome and thank you.
My mother used to repeat the story of her arrival in Salmon Arm to meet her soon-to-be in-laws. Mom was a young nurse from a loving Ukrainian prairie family. The in-laws were English and a little chillier than she was used to. After dinner the first evening, the in-laws, he was a notary and she was his secretary, presented the soon-to-be married couple with last wills, prepared and ready for signature. Mom was shocked and saddened. She wanted to think of her new life as a married woman. She did not want to speak of death. During the following decades, as a nurse, a daughter, a sister, and a critical writer about the medical system, Mom eventually could not stop talking about death, even in death. A few days after her medically assisted death, the local newspaper printed her biography. Some of you may have been here in 2018 when I told Mom's made story. And now it seems that I have taken up Mom's case. During the next few minutes, I want to say three things. Why should people speak about death? Then ways and words to use in normalizing talk of death, and a few words about medically assisted death. This talk is not for everyone. This kind of talk is not for everyone. And I acknowledge that I tend away from an Eastern communitarian view and more toward a Western individualistic approach to speaking of death. I understand why people under the age of 40 do not want to think about death. For most of us, when we are 40, our parents are still in pretty reasonable health, and we do not have to think of mortality. Then in our 40s and 50s, if we are lucky enough to have living parents with whom we share a reasonable or even loving relationship, our elders start to deal more closely with their own mortality, and we are drawn into those conversations. There are will updates at the office of a notary or lawyer. There are more frequent medical appointments. There may be downsizing and the attendant division of precious things. And then one day it happens. A cancer diagnosis, a heart attack, or maybe that unexplained new dent in Dad's car. Until now, death has been far away, but now death is knocking quietly, even if you do not understand the sound. If you are a Victoria person younger than 60, there's a reasonable chance that you have not been prepared by church, synagogue, temple, or lodge meeting. It is likely that you don't have a vocabulary around death, and that's going to be a problem for you. So why host a conversation about death? In my work as a Unitarian lay chaplain, I meet with families who are grieving the impending death of someone, that is to say that the patient is well into the dying process, or they are grieving the recent death of their loved one. In most cases, the bereaved struggle with the language to describe what is happening to them, and they don't know what to say or how to act. They may have thoughts on the soul, heaven, guilt, fear, dread, or relief. And these thoughts might surprise them. and their confusion can lead them to make decisions or accept advice that they later regret. I see part of my job as being an interpreter of death. Any normalizing discussion of death and dying will help me and citizens prepare for and deal with their feelings and actions when a close person dies. In a normalizing vein, my Unitarian friend, the obstetrician Murray Enkin, was fond of repeating the words of the philosopher George Santayana. There is no cure for birth and death, save to enjoy the interval. One way Murray helped his family to enjoy his life and theirs was by planning his estate with their help. Normalizing talk of death is exemplified by Dr. Catherine Mannix, a UK palliative doctor who has attended 10,000 to 15,000 deaths. On CBC Whitecoat recently, she said, "I'm confident in saying that usually ordinary dying with symptoms well palliated is okay. You know, none of us is going to be in a hurry to go. It's not going to be your best day, but you've had way worse days in terms of uncomfortable experience than that last day is going to be." Just take a moment to acknowledge the phone in the room. A step toward normalizing talk of death is to have a discussion about values, heaven, hell, and the afterlife or not. I've been surprised when I plunged into the deep end and asked friends who were dying, "What do you think happens after we die?" Recognizing that what is said and what is heard can be problematic, let me tell you that most of my dying friends have replied, nothing. My dad even made a sound and waved his hand to accompany the answer. Asking this question abstractly and thinking seriously about the answer can be a way to share thoughts of death and start a conversation. It might be easier to dip a toe into the shallow end first with a discussion of values. There are lists of values on the internet. Is duty important, Dad? Or, which charities do you support, Mom? You might be surprised by the answers. Before I forget, it's important when thinking of death to think of our own values. Take a moment every now and then to write down your values and perhaps a list of charities that you admire, even if you don't donate to them. What do you want people to learn in your obituary or from your eulogy? Personally, I keep delaying this step, but I intend to write my own obituary and eulogy so that the correct stories get out there. Maybe we could have a workshop about that. Rarely does everything go so smoothly. I can share one story. A Unitarian woman asked me to visit her mom, also a Unitarian, in the cancer ward at the Jubilee because the daughter wanted help with memorial planning. I thought this meant that both women had discussed memorial planning. The mom welcomed me to sit at her bedside. We knew each other, and we chatted about her cancer. I asked her to tell me about the town where she was born and about her siblings. I asked if she had favorite poems, and she said no. Did she have favorite hymns from her childhood in England? Oh, yes, she replied, and she started singing one to her wide-eyed daughter and I. After one verse, the mom stopped and asked me, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm preparing your memorial." And she said, "Oh, no, you're not. I'm not dying." The daughter apologized to both of us for not being clearer. The mom said she did not want to burden her daughter with thoughts of death. But when mom died a few days later, my notes formed the start of her eulogy and the first hymn. A burden on her daughter. In my opinion, the real burden was in not talking about death. I want us all to be clear with ourselves. Talking about death neither hastens nor causes death. Not talking about death does not prevent death. In my experience, once the initial discomfort is worn off, then talk of death can happen. Yet people have a tough time getting started. Mothers and fathers do not want to burden their kids. The kids don't want to scare their parents. And there's not a third person, like a clergy member or chaplain or palliative care nurse, to start speaking of death. There are words that we use and need to use, like death and dead, or the dying process. There are things to decide: cremation, burial, green burial. The obituary. What could be in the obituary? Should there be a funeral, a memorial, or a celebration of life? I'm not perfect at this. I've talked with people about after you're gone instead of looking at them and saying, after you're dead. I'd like to encourage the words memory, legacy, planning, and my favorite, values, religious values, spiritual values, financial and charitable values. No matter what words you use, I think it's important to start the conversation. As some Buddhists say, a day without thinking about death is a day wasted. Eventually, asking either, what do you think makes for a good death? Or tell me about when grandma or grandpa died, how did it go? Were you there? These can start a rich conversation. The Memorial Society of BC has helpful funeral planning tools on its website as well, for instance. Briefly on the subject of medical assistance in dying, or MAID, I believe that MAID has simplified some of the conversations about death. Under the current law, the applicant's death must be reasonably foreseeable. That is to say, death is already standing at the door. But talking about MAID, not as a crime or the sin of suicide, and nor as a rush to death, but as an acceptance of the inevitability of death, can help to open the door to further discussions of what death means to all concerned. I appreciate now how many obituaries include the phrase, died peacefully at home and surrounded by family, or include, thanks to Dr. Stephanie Green. Perhaps you could start talking about death by reading a few obituaries together, perhaps lubricated by favorite beverages. So during this brief introduction, I've talked about three things: why people should talk about death, ways and words to use in normalizing talk of death, and a few words about medically assisted deaths. I appreciate your attentiveness and look forward to hearing from my panelist friends and then your questions and comments.
I think I'll use this. Welcome to those of you who braved the November evening to come out. Welcome to those of you who are attending from your offices and home via Zoom. I'm going to talk briefly about three things. What happens when we don't talk about death? What happens when we do talk about death? And is opportunity to talk about death the same as a duty to talk about death? Now, I'm going to be drawing from my own experience here, my own life. I do have 40 years of working in palliative care in a variety of roles, yes, but the impetus for that professional life in palliative care and my fervent belief in the importance of quality of care at the end of life is born of these personal events. The first, what happens when we don't talk about it? The year is 1974, and my beloved maternal grandmother is dying of advanced abdominal cancer. She didn't know. Her doctor wouldn't tell her. He was a physician trained in the 40s and 50s. He was at the end of his career, and his view was, I only tell somebody if they ask me. Her husband, not my grandfather, but her husband, was of the old school, and his belief was, if you tell somebody they have cancer, they will give up. You will take away the hope, and you betrayed them, and you made them die. That was the state in 1974. And so there was my beloved grandmother, and getting smaller and smaller every week, shrinking, and perplexed why the food tasted bad, and she kept feeling awful, and And she began to lash out a little. This woman had never lashed out in her life. I had never seen her criticize my mother or family members, ever. And here she was, upset and lashing out. In my view, she was suffering. Nor was she able to access her faith. She had been a very devoted Anglican. She had attended church every week. She had a Bible beside her bed. Her Anglican faith had been a fundamental part of her life through adversity, through a great deal. But during this time, it offered no solace to her at all. And I think that's partly because she didn't know what was going on. And then it advanced. We reached July 1974. We now have a race on our hands. I am pregnant with my first child, her first grandchild. I am 9 months pregnant. And then she gets admitted to Hospital Victoria General. Now that's where I was going to be giving birth to the first child. So we now have a race. Is grandma going to die first, or is the child going to be born first? Will she get to see this first grandchild? And I went in to visit her, and she was in the basement of Victoria General, the one that was on Fairfield Road at the time. And by this time, she's so cachectic. She's so tiny and weak, and she's got this furrowed brow. And I visit, and she says to me, "Dee Dee, get me out of here. Fly me up to Masset. They're killing me." She was fearful. She had no comfort at all, to say nothing of pain control, which is a different matter. And she never did reach a point of comfort or solace because the cone of silence was there. I mean, her husband had said to us, "Nobody tells Ivy." He was adamant, and we lived that cone or conspiracy of silence. And it was very painful. It was painful for her. It was painful for the family members I observed, and it was certainly painful for me, a fairly new registered nurse. In terms of the race, I attended Grandma's funeral on my child's due date. He came later. Fast forward 35 years. What happens when we do talk about it? So my late husband, his name was Don, he was the reverse. Don loved information. He loved truth. He loved honesty. And an example of that is the week he was diagnosed with C of the prostate. What did we do? We went off to the library at the BC Cancer Agency. It's a fine department, by the way. And he came home with books and videos, and he introduced himself to the librarian. Her name was Lillian. And the next thing I know, Lillian and Dawn are emailing back and forth. And I've got this article and that article. And that's how he wanted to face his illness. And then 7 years later, we learned that his cancer had metastasized to bone. So we knew this meant that he would not, he would succumb to his cancer and that his treatments would now be palliative in nature. What did he do? He told people he was dying. "Hi, I'm dying." Now, when he first started to tell people, he was still bounding down the neighborhood, walking the dog, wearing his Chile hat and his safari coat, and people were a little taken aback. But that was him. And after a while, you know, they would joke and say, "You're looking pretty good, Don, for a dying guy." Yeah, yep. But his pastor, the Unitarian Church, one Reverend Jane Ramadat, had heard that Don was very open about talking about living with dying. So she contacted him and said, "Can I visit you?" And she came out to visit and said, "I've been looking for a while for somebody who'd be willing to talk about this. And you seem to be somebody who's willing to talk about this. Would you speak at church?" And he said, "Sure." And together they mapped out the kind of things he was prepared to cover. And she posed some questions and he posed some ideas. And so it was set up. And one Sunday morning, he did just that, sitting at a table like this and speaking to the audience. And people were very moved. People wrote him following. One woman wrote him and said, listening to your honesty, I just feel like you've changed my life. I can talk about things more freely. And so because I knew that he was comfortable with that experience and that it had met some people's needs, I thought about nursing students. And my colleague is Kobe Shantz. Kobe teaches nursing students at UVic on campus, palliative care. So I said to Don, would you be willing to talk to nursing students, just like you did, a little more intimate in a classroom? He said, sure. And that's what we did. Don came in, I think he gave them an hour and talked about what it's like for him to be living with dying and knowing you're dying. And then he said, ask questions. He just opened, what do you want to ask? Here's these nursing students, you know, you've got this articulate, willing person. Well, 4 years following that, Don was dying in hospice. And at this point, he is very weak. He's non-communicative. We just have hours to days left. And a nurse approached me and said, did your husband ever speak to nursing students at UVic? And I said, yes. And she said, I was there. I listened. And I was so moved by what he had to say, I went into palliative care. And she said, and now I'm so pleased I can provide care for him. That was so precious. That was a legacy. He gave to her, she gave to him. It was very precious. Now, having said that, do I believe that the opportunity to talk about dying is a duty to talk about it? No, I don't. And I know that for some, it'll be cultural and cultural practices that will influence that, and that's fine. But I think it's important that an opportunity exists if people want it. And I think it's helpful to remember that we can speak about this either directly or indirectly. And for some, that's the best way to approach it. And one way to approach things indirectly is through the use of metaphor. Now, much has been written about the benefits or the usefulness of metaphor because it is, after all, like poetry. It's the way of saying something without saying it. It throws a life ring out to somebody and they can either reach out and take it or not, because after all, you didn't say it, right? I've often used metaphor with patients with very good results. And you know, even persons with dementia respond to metaphor or to symbolic language. My example of that, again, I turned to a family member. This family member is 98 years of age. Her name was Auntie Jessie. She was dying in Glengarry. And she'd had an advanced dementia for about 2 years. And we hadn't had a really cogent conversation, probably for a year. At this point, I can see she's dying. She's no longer eating or taking fluids. She's in bed. She looks very low. And I think to myself, you know, she's not going to be here a week from now. So I leaned over and I just quietly said, Auntie Jessie, you've come to the fork in the road and you must go and I must stay. And I just let that hang there in the air. I certainly wasn't expecting anything back. And this voice says very clearly, then take very good care of yourself, my dear. So there we have it. My views on the importance of speaking about death and dying, born out of personal experience and reinforced often by my professional experience.
Good evening, and thank you for coming, and thank all of you for coming. Yes, I'm taller than Deanna. I very much appreciate Kobe's invitation for us to add a question mark to our speaking of death. And I think as I have aged, I have more and more questions and not less and less. I've been working with the hospice palliative response team for the last 17 years, which means that I am at the bedside of people who are coming closer to their death or are actually dying. I have borne witness to many peaceful, comfortable deaths, both with medically assisted death and natural, more natural deaths. And I've also seen horrifying deaths. And what I feel is that if we know one dying person, we know one dying person. We're very quick to make generalizations. And as human beings, I think we are generally very uncomfortable with uncertainty. And we're not so happy about vulnerability either. And the fortunate or unfortunate reality is when we come to the time of our dying, if we are conscious, there will be both uncertainty and vulnerability. And almost all of the people around us, arguably, will know less about it than we do, while thinking they have good advice for us about how we should be doing this. And so to me, the question, there's more questions than answers. There is an invitation. As a larger Western culture, we don't talk very easily about death here or here at the same time as we are obsessed with death, a lot of death imagery and movies where people are dramatically blown up. So this kind of obsession with while looking away at the same time that I find quite fascinating. So should we talk about death as compared to, are we allowed to talk about death? Who is allowed to talk about death? Who isn't allowed to talk about death? Who starts conversations? And Deanna, you said there are cultural issues, and there are, including who is allowed to speak in particular families and who is not allowed to speak in particular families. I've been working closely with a family over the last month or so where one family member is in charge of the telephone translator and makes decisions about whether the other people in the room are translated or not, including the person dying who is begging to be heard to speak without much success. I tend to be a very information-seeking person. I myself dealt with a potentially life-threatening cancer, which luckily for me did not kill me. And I dealt with it by information. That's what I wanted. And almost all my anxiety was about not having enough information. But that said, that isn't true. That isn't true for everyone. I had again, I've learned so much from the people that we have the honor, Kobe and I, to work with. And so I was in a home recently where I asked, would it be helpful to have some information about how this process might unfold? And the daughter, who was a deeply, deeply religious Eastern European woman, said to me, "You Canadians and your desire to know everything and your need for information, and you think that you can control everything. For us, the absolutely best death would be if she dropped dead unexpectedly, and we spent this period of her life being focused on joy and on living and on outings, not looking for symptoms that might occur that might worry us." She thought I was hilarious that I was offering her some information. At the same time, because I respected that, over the course of some other conversations we talked about, she had actually called the funeral home. She did know a little bit about what to expect. She did know who to call if something went sideways. So to me, what is important is that we have space to talk about death, such as we are creating here together. So really, more than wanting to talk a whole bunch at you, what I'm interested in is, why are you here? And why are you here? What is it that brought you to want, honestly, to have a conversation? I do want to say, I think, I want to speak in favor of euphemism, because I think that we think that we ought to use the word death and dying. And I think sometimes we ought to use the word death and dying in the same way that we ought to use anatomical terms for body parts. But we might want to begin, again, who gets to make the decision? Does the person who's dying get to decide if we will talk about it? Does the family get to decide? Does the professional get to decide? And so if someone talks to me in a home about passing away or losing, I will talk to them about passing away and losing. It's not that I would censor myself, but I also will not insist that they use my language because I think they should. Whereas I had a colleague years ago who literally decided that in every home she was going to use the word death or dying no matter what they said, which didn't actually go very smoothly in those actual homes. I think similarly, we have an idea that funeral planning or advanced care planning would be a useful thing to do. And it might be, or it might not be. Truly what I know is that I don't know unless I ask. And as I was going through my own terrifying, close to death possibility experience, there's something really different about us talking theoretically about death and dying. And oh, people die of this. Oh, I could die of this. Oh, I could be dying of this. And so these layers of visceral understanding of mortality and impermanence, which is a lovely philosophical and spiritual idea and not that fun for most people to be faced with. And at that time, people would try to engage me in conversations that were very deep and important conversations, but I would leave from those conversations sometimes feeling like I had talked beyond what was actually good for me. I had talked because they were curious and not because I wanted to talk at a cost to myself. And I was also very aware as I was climbing upwards, I might have looked like I was in denial. It wasn't that I didn't know that down existed. Of course I knew that down existed. I just didn't really want people around pointing that out to me right now while I was climbing upwards. If I was falling, I would have wanted to have a different conversation. So I think part of dialogue is to speak, and our openness to speak and our willingness to tell deep heart truths. And part of dialogue is to bear witness and to listen deeply to those who are dying, to those who are suffering as their loved one dies, and to be willing to lean into whatever conversation people might start, to float an invitation to speak without insisting that people want to speak. So that in palliative care, we truly are focusing on life. How do we live well until the moment that we are no longer alive, instead of trying to get people focused too early on dying, honestly, in my opinion. So I'm willing to answer. I tend to be quite quiet, and I'm going to stop talking now, but I'm willing to answer anything, including if you are interested, how that process often goes, or whatever it might be that you might be interested in talking about.
So now we have an opportunity to have some conversation. The conversation will be public fundamentally. But before we sort of talk with the folks here and the folks with us on Zoom, I want to give you folks a chance to talk among yourselves. If there are things that Peter said that Misha, you'd like to pick up on or respond to or reflect on, I'd love to hear that. So can we have maybe 10 minutes or so for the three of you to talk? And if you don't have anything to talk about, I have a question I wouldn't mind having each of you answer, but I think you probably can go by yourself.
One thing I have found, because I'm a newbie at this, having only been with about 30 people, is what do you do after? I get into my car and I drive away, and then I'm always sort of left hanging. There are resources I could call on, friends, other chaplains, but I tend to deal with it myself. And I find this work is so gratifying and so exhausting. How do you deal with it?
Turn to the one who's living it on a regular basis.
Who's living it at the moment.
Yeah.
I think it's a very intelligent question. These are big, evocative moments in people's lives with a lot of emotion. So a lot of mirror neurons for those of us who are functioning in a care providing kind of a role. When I took over my position from Eve Joseph, who writes very eloquently about palliative care. She's a poet, but she was in the position that I'm now in. And she said to me when I very first started, you must have a way to let go of people so the dead don't walk around with you. And so it was so striking for me at the moment. And so to really be intentional in some way, whether we do that symbolically, but to have some way to let things go, whether I drive away with the windows open and the being blown by the wind, or I touch the door frame on my way out, like one might touch a mezuzah, or I consciously think about putting them in a little bubble of protection and letting them go. And I think if we don't, it doesn't serve us. One of the other things that I think is very important in doing care work is not only compassion, which is obviously a care competency, but self-compassion. And so how do we provide care to ourselves in the moment that we're in a home as we leave the home afterwards? And one of the interesting things about the self-compassion research that I think is the other reason we should be practicing self-compassion, some very interesting research done by Kristen Neff and some colleagues of hers, people who care providers and family members who practiced more self-compassion were less likely to try to control other people in a way that the other people could feel. And so for me, self-compassion practice and some of those physical practices, right? Compassionate self-touch, those kind of things have been very useful. And then finally, to call on our colleagues when we need to. So the hospice actually has a counselor who was on my team, but no longer does the work. And she is available to us anonymously. So you go to see her and she bills the hospice. Somebody came to see me. And I did go the first time that I went to see her. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I had been working for the hospice for about 5 years. And I was dreaming that there was a dead blonde woman in my trunk and I wasn't worried. And the dream woke me up. And literally I thought, okay, 8:30 in the morning, calling Heather Fox. Right, so people stay with us. We are, in order to do this work, you have to be open-hearted. We are deeply moved by the work. At the same time, people stay at the hospice, sometimes working 20, 30, 40 years, right? So if you are cut out to do the work, I don't find it tiring, honestly, or difficult, but an individual experience needs digestion. Yeah, is this what you're meaning?
Yeah.
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 I'd like to actually make a comment and then I'll respond to that. I'm aware that as PRT, there's 2 of you who go in, the nurse and the counselor.
And the nurse is alone.
Right. Getting back to yourself, does the fact that you have a colleague in the car as you drive away, is that also a chance to share it, decompress a little, in contrast to the person who gets in the car
and is all alone
and drives away alone?
Yes.
Because as I think back of having colleagues there, the people I was with were on a unit, so I always had a nurse there. The ways that I lived with it at the time when I was a direct care and being with a lot of people, do you know, I often wrote about it. I was new to the field. I worked there for 10 years, but in those years, to me, it was about the nuggets. I was so aware that dying people gave nuggets. There was something precious to think about, and I would write about it because I wanted to learn. I wanted to get better and build mastery. And the act of writing about it, for me, allowed a great deal to move through me, or to make sense of it, or to stay, not just walk around with it, but to stay almost as a little beacon.
Like to stay in a good way.
In a positive way.
Yes.
I think about a French woman one night, it was her last night of living, and she just got this urge to tell people that her life lessons, and she grabbed me as a nurse when I made rounds and said, I have to tell you things. And she must have talked for 20 minutes about never let somebody, do this to you, or always be true to you. It was just, and so I went home and I wrote all her nuggets down, So that's how
I drink.
For many years in the Navy, the traditions.
There is drinking involved, but I have a circle of friends that we go for walks. My brother and John, as you know, and others who are close to me. And I think when I go out with them, I want to talk about things other than the memorial or the death. And in the back of my mind, I'm processing it somehow. And eventually it goes into that treasured place where I have all those people. And I still have, I can still, almost at the drop of a hat, repeat the eulogies of everyone I've been with, including my parents.
So in a moment, we're going to turn the conversation over to the public. For those of you in the public who are joining us via Zoom, you'll see a chat function, and you can pose questions in the chat function. Rachel, my colleague, will wave her hand and get my attention, and we'll put you into the queue. We will also have folks who are in the room in the actual queue. Prior to that, though, all three of you, in one way or another, made reference to the individualism that was implicit in some of the reflections that you're sharing, because of course you're dealing with the death of one person, and you are one person having the experience of supporting. But you also talked about kind of the traditions that are kind of in the room and in the family and in the culture at large that shape the way the death is understood, experienced, and the way some kind of reintegration might be experienced. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit about that tension between what's happening to that person in the bed, but also what's happening to the aunties and uncles in the room, or to the Baba and Zeta who are in the room, or whatever, to the other folks who are invested in this experience. And do you see yourself kind of as tending to, nursing to, ministering to them as well? And if so, how? Because there is a tendency in our culture to focus strictly, I think, on the thing that's occurring right there. But of course, that thing is embedded in the broader social, cultural context.
I think I'm tending more to the people who are in the room and not lying, the standing ones, not the lying down ones. Because, and my experience is limited mostly to Unitarians and humanists and agnostics and Vancouver Island people who more like, was it Don, who wanted more information? And they have a pretty good, the people who are lying down in this situation, they have a pretty good idea of what's happening. It's their nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters and kids who are having trouble with it. And I have had one or two times when I've walked out of the room because the family has got some important business to do about dad. And I don't need to be part of that business because I'm not a counselor. I'm a scribe.
I think I'll again let you answer that.
I think similarly, Peter. So my team goes to a home where there's some type of crisis for someone who is imminently or less imminently dying. And that might be a symptom crisis, but it might also be a psychosocial crisis, a caregiver who has announced, that's it, I'm not doing this anymore. If somebody doesn't do something, we're going to the hospital and I'm dropping you off and I'm not taking you home. And so I might meet patients, people in the bed who could speak to me, but I equally might not. So I might spend some time quietly with them, but most of my care is with the family. And I would try to offer conversation to every person in the home, whether that's 2 people or 15 people, and to try to get a sense of both how are they doing and how do they know the person who's lying down. Because sometimes some of that work that needs to be done is because each different person in the family has a different relationship with that person, knows them differently, and therefore thinks something different should happen. And so part of what we're doing is not only supporting symptomatically the person and supporting individually the people, but trying to help them to support each other and to speak to each other. In the possibly most difficult visit I ever made, the nurse and I walked into a home with an elderly woman who was dying, her 8 children, their 8 spouses. And when we arrived in the home, not one couple would speak to any other couple in the home. They would only speak to us. So we started with 2s, and then we slowly made alliances of 4s, 6. It took us about 4 hours, but eventually we could come to a plan for what we could actually do for the woman, because we could not do anything because there was no representation. That would have been advanced care planning would have been useful in that situation, to know who she wanted to speak for her, because she could not tell us.
Deanna?
And
The building is taking off.
Are we leaving? That's very interesting.
So folks, those of you who are in Zoom land, you may not be hearing this, but it sounds like there's an airplane in the hallway. And it may be, Scott, if you could just open that door. I have a feeling it might be an error question. There we go, see? I should have been an engineer, right? I said that to an engineer once and he said, "You'd be a very hungry engineer." Thanks, Scott. Yeah, just leave it open. That was very peculiar. Sorry, Deanna.
All right.
It's as though some higher power didn't want you to share your opinions.
Yes, right. I appreciate the question. As a nurse, I did feel, I'll use the word hypervigilant at the time, as someone was dying. So yes, I was responsible for the patient. So I'm keenly aware of that. But there's a high level of attention and intention as someone is literally having their last moments. And so I would feel acutely aware of what the family was doing or thinking or feeling. And what a basic fundamental tenet of palliative care is the family is the unit of care, which was a very liberating concept to me. It wasn't like the only person I needed to be concerned about or provide care to was the one who was lying in the bed. I mean, I was equally eligible to sit down and have a cup of tea and talk with family. But it was a time of high vigilance. Usually, the patient, as they were in their last moments, is comfortable. Usually, we had achieved good symptom control. Their needs were looked after. So by and large, I could focus on the family.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much for starting off that conversation. Now we have an opportunity to hear from the Zoom public and the local public. So who has a question? Martin has a question in the back. We have folks with mics so that the other people on Zoom can hear you.
Hi, I just wanted, first of all, to thank the 3 of you for what you do and your presentation today. And you have my admiration for your work. I can how difficult it is, and also how it must draw on all your personal resources to do what you do. My question, I don't know much about palliative care, so I was interested to hear this last comment about the family being the unit of care. I'm also just very interested in how you deal with the dying individual, and you must come across all kinds of individuals from all kinds of backgrounds, cultures, beliefs. Some will be very calm at death, some will be frightened, some will want reassurances, some will want guidance. So what resources do you have at your disposal to address the differing needs, not only culturally, but individually of the great diversity of human beings that you will come across?
Thanks, Martin. Good question.
Is that a me question?
Why don't you start?
I'll start. So another basic tenet of palliative care is that it's an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary field, that no one person, no one profession can meet the multifaceted needs of a dying person and or family. And so you bring who you are and your skill set, but you also are involved, you're thinking, I think this is a Misha time, or I think we need to have the chaplain in here, or we need a palliative doc and we need him now. So you are always working in a multidisciplinary fashion. That would be my first response to that.
And I think in Victoria, we're so lucky to have such a robust team. So I do a lot of palliative care education, and I hear us talking about team, and I'm well aware that some of the people who are taking these courses, they are the team, okay? Unless they really think outside the box. So the palliative response team on any given day is a palliative care physician with a palliative trained specialist nurse, with a palliative trained specialist counselor, with a box of supplies, with a trunk of supplies, who will come to your house, who has access to GPs, other physicians, our spiritual care provider, community social workers, home care nurses, et cetera, so that we really can draw a robust team around people. And then to help them, if they aren't already mobilized, to mobilize their own team. So who is it that they would want around, who would be helpful? I appreciated how you framed just like all this myriad of people with myriad needs. And so one of the most skillful questions that I was ever taught as a palliative care provider comes from Harvey Chachnoff, who's a palliative care specialist. He's a psychiatrist. And the question that he recommends us to ask is a modification of one of the first questions I was asked to teach as a counselor. And his question is, what do we need to know about you as a person to take the very best care of you? And people know, even if they don't necessarily know why they're telling you. Can I tell my Doris Day story? Can you hear it again? Mm-hmm. So my favorite example of listening to this story, I asked an elderly gentleman this question. He was being cared for by his daughters. He had suffered from an alcohol addiction and it had been extremely difficult on these girls, but they had pulled together to care for him. And I asked him, first time I met him, what would we need to know about you? And he said, I don't really understand your question, dear. And I said to him, well, if you were having a really difficult time, what would you do to soothe yourself? If you were feeling stressed, what would you do? Oh, he said, do you know Doris Day, dear? I said, of course I know Doris Day. Do you know CSRS, dear? I said, of course I know that. So he sang a few bars and he said, that's what I do. When I'm stressed, I sing that to myself. And so months went by, we settled his symptoms. We didn't see him for months. And now we were called in for a second time because he was actively dying. He was delirious. He was unable to communicate in a fashion that we understood what he needed. And he had been crying for a couple of days, weeping and weeping and weeping, and his poor daughters. And we had tried Haldol, and we had tried Nosnan, and we had tried Ativan, and I don't know if we had gotten to midazolam yet, but we were trying all kinds of things medically to settle this. Nothing was settling it, and they kept phoning. And so on maybe their fourth or fifth phone call, the nurse had her hands full, and I answered the phone. And I said to the daughter who I knew, I don't know if this has anything to do with anything, but the day that I met your dad, here's what he told me. He told me that if he was distressed, he would sing Que Sera Sera. And I barely got the sentence out of my mouth, and I can hear her calling to her sister, Angie, come, quick, Que Sera Sera. And they gathered at his bedside, and the three daughters sang it to him, and he stopped crying, and he died. If we ask, people will throw their little Hansel and Gretel crumbs, so we will know how to follow them.
Thank you. Beautiful story. Rachel, there's a question on Zoom, yeah? Sure.
So a question from Jan to start. She is asking if you could please discuss your experience with family members who disagree strongly with the decisions made by the dying member.
You mean the life decisions or the how to die decisions? So for people on Zoom, the question is about context in which people disagree with the decisions about how to die that have been made about the patient.
I like to ask the person who is dying if they're still able to, and then the kids. I mean, quite often the kids I deal with are in their 50s and 60s, but they're still the kids at that moment, about values, and not to go straight to the question of green burial, cremation, any of that, but to go to what did this person value in life, and try and get a conversation going about whether they had friends. How did their friends go? Had they been to a good funeral or a bad funeral, and how did that go? And people can often speak in the third person or about a case that they saw. They went, as one of my friends says, I've been to some shitty funerals. And I'll say, well, what made them so bad? This happened and this happened and this happened. I said, so you'd probably like those things not to happen? Yes, I would like those things not to happen. Just starting that conversation around values and what the person liked or didn't like can at least continue the conversation. I don't know if that completely answers Jan's question, but maybe.
Yeah, Talia.
Sorry. It's about how to die. So if a dying person has expressed a certain desire about how they might die, and the family disagrees with that, what's been your experience of dealing with that sort of situation? Because I'm sure that's arise.
First of all, I just want to say that those are some of the most painful visits, honestly, to make, where a person has expressed a wish and other family members disagree, and it's not unusual. And how that might look so different. So I've met families where the person in a very fractured family has made the decision not to tell any of the family members that he's choosing an assisted death until after he has died. I have met ill people who are absolutely and utterly exhausted and ready to die in the context of a family who believes that the only good death is to die fighting, and believes that the person has become mentally ill because they don't want to fight anymore. And so again, if we have information from the person, but Peter, you've mentioned values a couple of times, and I think that that is so important. And there's actually brand new advanced care planning research that says in the long run, people's life-held values will have more to do with the way that they die than anything that they've written down. And kind of ongoing conversations, but many families don't have ongoing conversations. And I think we underestimate how difficult it is for decision makers, temporary decision makers, when someone has lost capacity in their state of grief and underslept and exhausted, to make clear decisions based on what that person would want and not what they want. There is a very helpful tool called Fiero's 4 Questions. There's a book called, first of all, by Monica Williams Murphy called It's Okay to Die. She's an American emergency room physician who became very concerned about how people were dying in emergency rooms, and writes about palliative care from an emergency room physician perspective. And it's got all kind of tools in it, but and although they are American, they're very usable. And one of the tools in that book is called Fiero's 4 Questions. And Fiero is another emergency room physician. And I learned this from an oncologist, and can't tell you the 4 questions off the top of my head, but they are basically, tell me about your person. Tell me about what kind of person they've been. Tell me about their favorite things. Tell me about their likes and dislikes. And then if they could get up out of the bed and they could hear what the medical team has just said, and they could look at themselves as they look in the bed lying there, what would they tell us to do? And honestly, I've seen miracles. I've seen families in complete fractiousness ask themselves this question, and instantly it is obvious to all of them what should be done. Yeah. It's a very good question.
But Misha, you've all mentioned in one way or another the fractured families you have to deal with. And I'm thinking about a context in which the conversation about values or what so-and-so's life has been like arises around the deathbed. And the reflections that get shared by the kids, 50, 60-year-old kids, are that, well, he just loved money. He loved his career. He loved his mistresses. He loved hitting us occasionally. And that they tell a story of a wretched, tortured soul who made other people's lives difficult and painful. And this is, and I presume you walk into situations where people are trying to resolve that in the room in the last hours of this person's life, but of course that's going to be impossible, I would assume. Though it puts you as people who are trying to support the process and support the family in a terrible situation. And I wonder if you've had situations like that. I can easily imagine them.
The first time I got called to do a celebration of life was perhaps a good thing for me that I did not know this family. They weren't Unitarians. They were neighbors of Unitarians. And I walk in, there should be 4 adult kids, but one of them is not speaking to the other 3. And I say, well, with the 3 I've got here, let me start getting to know your mom. And I said, just to help me out, because it's the first time I'm meeting you, could you tell me your names in birth order? And your name, first name, and when you were born in birth order, just so and they had to have a little conference.
Uh-oh.
And the conference only lasted a minute or so, and they said, can we tell you a secret? And I'm not telling you who they were. We're not related to the lady who just died. In the 1950s, alcoholic fighting family, the neighbors took us in. That's the lady who just died. And she was only slightly better than our natural mom. And I said, okay, that's, thanks for telling me that. That's a good place to start. And he said, and that's part of the reason the 4th sibling won't join this party. It's because he's worried about what you're going to ask. I said, I don't have to say any of that. And then it turned out they pretty much hated her. And yeah, that was really tough. But I managed to pull together enough facts and things that she did well, times she didn't hit them. And you've got to sort of focus on that, because this is it. This is the last speech that's going to be made about her. And the family appreciated how I dealt with that, but that was quite a proving ground. And I've never had one that bad, but I've had a few come close.
And again, like permission to speak about the unspeakable, to make space to speak about what can't be spoken, and to have someone bear witness to that. Okay? And then a gallows humor, which I could see you have, which is very necessary to do this work.
I said during the celebration of life, and there were 50 or 60 people. It was a really well turned out thing. I think some of them were happy she was gone, and so I said, we're here to talk about the life of so-and-so. And she was a challenging driver. And people started to giggle because she was a terrible driver. And she had some strong opinions. And then even all the kids started to laugh. And the gallows humor paid off in that one. It wouldn't in every situation, and I wouldn't use it in every situation. But in that case, we were all there out of a sense of duty. And we saw her away in a way that was respectful and as kind as it could be.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that one, because my experience was always in hospital, and I had the benefit of the counselor and others to assist that. The one who faces the most of that kind of fracture is Misha. And I think that example you gave of walking in to a family where 8 siblings don't speak to one another, I couldn't begin to have to face that.
There's an anthropological concept called the good death, where you've paid off all your debts, you've told the people you need to tell that you love them, and you've resolved any kind of negative relationships you've had throughout your life. And I think many people don't have either a good death, and some people don't even have a good life. And so it seems to me that to talk about dying is to enter into that whole legacy that they're leaving and the damage they've done. And if you have 6 hours or 6 days or whatever to work with them and the family, whether you have a full team or not, it's going to take a toll on you as a person who's coming in more or less blind, you know, as Peter did, right?
One of my colleagues comments that we think that illness and dying and death will be a magic wand that will fix relationships, and instead what it is a magnifying glass that will bring forward all of the challenges and strengths of a particular family.
Mary Louise.
Oops, thank you. I happen to be living in seniors independent living, and there's quite an age range, say from the late 70s up to 100 or 102. You need to be well to be there or to be independent. And one of the things that I think Peter is alluding to as values, one of the things I'm finding is important for people who are not unafraid to talk about death directly with me, just as a listener. I have a history of working in healthcare as a chaplain, and I'm used to listening to or to being with people to talk about their dying. But I find that many people are engaged in finding meaning in whatever life they have left to them, so that they're beginning to be reflective about some event that they hadn't thought about for a long time, or they are taking on a project that they find grants meaning to them in terms of their lives having been worth the time and care that they've invested in themselves professionally and personally. And I think that sometimes for a dying person, when they are in palliative care or making decisions about coming to the dying time of their lives, can help them feel that they have, I've written the final chapter, this kind of not being conscious enough of their mortality to be able to put together something that is meaningful personally to them. And that has been something I found the center to be very helpful with this recent year, was to help a survivor get his book published and talked about, a Holocaust survivor. And that was just amazing and beautiful, and it opened the door for so many other people to recognize the importance of this. So I want to say thank you for your presentations this evening.
Rachel?
I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question myself. So today is the Day of the Dead, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Misha, I was struck by when you said having to let them go or else they're going to follow you around. And I was struck by that because of what today is, and kind of other conceptions of death and the undead, or the people who have passed, and the connections that we have, and the boundaries between the living and the dead are more porous in certain cultural contexts and religious contexts. So I'm wondering if a part of the kind of hesitation around talking about death in kind of Western cultures is because we don't have that rich conception of a porous boundary. And so I'm wondering if you can reflect on what today is and how that might impact how you think about these transitions, and how maybe some of the people that you're helping might think about that. I don't know if that makes sense, but I was struck by different conceptions of people who still follow you around, and maybe that's not a bad thing.
I don't mind if my people follow me around. They do. I just don't want everyone else's people following me around. I think that there's really something to it. And I think one of the ways that it's really done people a disservice in the West in the past is that we had an idea of bereavement as having to get over a death. And I think we're getting smarter about that now and starting to, like when I was starting to do counseling, if you were still bereaved 5 years later, you were just considered to be in a pathological state of grief. And I think now we have much more made space for changing our relationship to the person who's gone when they are no longer here in this physical form. And so I certainly talk to people about that before death. So family members about how to maintain relationship, about things that they might want to keep that feel like the person, smell like the person for the weeks after the passing. And I think that there are some cultural traditions that are really wise in this regard, hey, that regularly we make contact with our ancestors, for example. Okay, that we grieve for a certain period of, in Judaism, we grieve for a certain period of time, and then at a year, another public ceremony where people gather together. And so I wonder if part of what happens for people in the West who don't have any kind of traditions is just that not knowingness has nowhere to go.
Thanks. That's a big part of what I have been dealing with families that have called me that have no religious tradition, or at least no imminent religious tradition, and they're not sure what to do, and they don't know what to say, and they don't know what to do after a year. So I try and give them stories. I don't tell them how to do it, but I say there's lots of suggestions, and I mark the Memorial Day of my mom and dad. My brother and I do that. I think that's a good start. One of the things that I learned in my chaplain training was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote about the stages of grief. Yes, I've forgotten the title of her book. Anyhow, I thought through a cursory knowledge of the book that you go through the stages and then you get through the end. And I learned in chaplaincy training, you don't go through the stages 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You go 1, and then you go 4 for a while, and then you go back to 1, and then you do 2 for a little while. And then a year later, 5 happens, and then 1 happens again. And then you've got to clean the house. And all 5 of them happen at once. And that was really helpful, and passing that along to people and saying, nothing has to happen quickly. You don't even have to remove the body from the house quickly. You've got time. And you don't have to sell the house, and you don't have to sell the belongings. You've got time. Take time, take care of yourselves. And that's not the start of a ritual, but it's part of me wanting to slow people down from, if you don't have any rituals, don't act because you think you should be doing something. It's one of the rare cases where being slower about things is better. The obituary doesn't have to go in the next day. The celebration of life doesn't have to be on Friday next week. It can happen months in advance. In fact, because of COVID, there have been a lot of people who didn't get memorialized or celebrated. And now we're starting to get those because we're allowed to gather in groups. So people want to have the celebration of life for Dad who passed away a year ago. They've got his ashes. They haven't done anything about it. The family hasn't gathered, and now they want to. And I think that's positive.
And you're also talking, if I'm hearing you properly, about allowing human experiences to be processes, not events. I think we want death to be an event, but it isn't an event. It's a process. And grieving is not an event. It's a process.
Yeah, right.
And I'd like to pick up on the word porous. You talked about, Rachel, that it's a the Day of the Dead is a porous time. So are those last hours with the last days. And in that porous time, people often move into a courageous place that they might not have been before. There's new breaking through. And I often saw courage from a dying person or their loved ones. Deeply gratifying. You could see the effort or the courage it would take. I'll give you one example. I had a man in his early 60s. He was dying. His cancer was likely going to give him a gentle death. And he lay awake all night, wrestling with that. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, he rang the bell. And he said to me, I think I'm ready to ask you what it's going to be like. And I want you to tell me. A porous time. I saw courage, I saw loyalty, I saw so much of the goodness of human condition come out during some of those porous times.
And it's part of why the work is not just hard. So I appreciated the reflection that it can be very hard and scary and upsetting work, but I feel like it is balanced with so much kindness, generosity, loyalty, love. Yeah.
Both, Peter just mentioned something about some of the logistics of death and dying that I think that's also not talked about. And when we had our planning discussion a little while ago, we talked about how many people don't know how long can the body stay there. What, do you have to call the police, or is there such a thing as a coroner? Do I call a coroner? Does who does this? Do the police? Who arranges this? How quickly do we have to make these decisions? And it strikes me that in a context in which there is a person is plugged into a capital R religious community, there's a kind of a way of doing things. A way of marking these big life passages that many of us who aren't connected to a capital R religious community won't have that resource to go to. And so then it puts a burden or gives you the responsibility of saying, here's what's going to happen at the logistical level. And then the question of here's what's going to happen at the physical level. So I suppose when that person says to you, I'd like you to come and tell me what's going to happen, he was asking about what am I likely to feel physically? What will my dying actually, what's the experience of my dying going to be like for me? Yeah, and then you have those two, in some sense, no religious community can adequately prepare anybody for that particular moment, but the question of the logistics, I wonder if you could reflect on either of those questions, the sort of experience that people want to know about, but then the logistics.
Why don't I get the easy question, the logistics part.
Okay.
That if the person was under care of the PRT, I'll leave that one to Misha. There have been cases where a person is not under the care of the palliative response team and they just kind of die. And if the person was elderly, and this is sort of, I'm speaking to everybody who might have to face this. If the person was elderly and they just die at home, don't call 911. Don't phone the police. If they've got a family, if they're one of the rare ones in British Columbia who has a family doctor, call the family doctor as a non-emergency call and say, so-and-so has died. And then the doctor will take care of some of the rest of the logistics, not all the logistics, but it will at least note that, might choose to come out if they can, if they haven't already retired and moved away to the clinic. And then the funeral homes, I've used funeral homes, and I have Earth's option on my cell phone, and I give them a call and I say, I'm at this address. When the family's ready, can you come and take their father away? And they're just, all of the companies are just super. And there's no rush. They'll come when they can. There's no need to wake anybody up at 3 a.m. The person who has died is not going anywhere, if we're lucky.
In terms of logistics, so if you or your family member know that you are dealing with something that you are likely to die from, register with the hospice, speak to your doctor, register with the hospice. So once you are registered with the hospice, your death is now expected, because otherwise you wouldn't be registered with the hospice. So no police or coroner. There's a form that's used in British Columbia, which your GP can fill out, called an EDITH, an expected death in the home form, which says this person is expected to die of the illness that they're dealing with. That goes to the funeral home, and then the family can wait for 1 hour after they believe death has occurred. Sometimes those are, again, like who gets to decide about speaking. So this is one of the things that informs my question about who gets to make that decision. I've been in many homes where the expected death in the home form is there because a professional thought it would be there. But when I talk to the family, they absolutely do not want to be the people who will make that call. They want a nurse to come. And again, in Victoria, if you're registered with the hospice, you're lucky because the nurse will come and she will do that or he will do that for you. Yeah, I've been in a few deaths where coroners were called by somebody who didn't know that, or a care aide in the home, and it is can be very difficult on family, right? So now the person is on the floor maybe getting chest compressions and police and kind of disturbance that doesn't generally improve people's bereavement. If you are interested in how a natural death from something like a cancer or organ failure or advanced dementia unfolds, you can go on the Victoria Hospice website, which is victoriahospice.org, and look in the resources, and you will find a brochure called Preparing for Death, which talks about a normal or usual process through to the end of life. And you were saying earlier, like you see great courage. In the 17 years, it is very rare for people to be fearful at the time of their death, even when they're awake, even if they were scared not that long before. But it's actually rare that people are fearful right at the end. What they are is tired.
I think we have another question on Zoom.
Yeah, so Carolyn Whitney Brown is wondering if you could share some thoughts about Bill C7, which is made for people for whom death is not imminent or inevitable. She says that it has raised some concerns in our society about making it easier for people to die than to live because of the lack of social resources and support. So wondering what that might add to the discussion around speaking of death. Because we have most of the examples tonight have been around folks whose death is imminent, right, or expected. So how might this impact the conversation? A big question for 628.
You can trust Carolyn to ask a brilliant question, but also beautiful, robust question 2 minutes before we're supposed to end. And this, interestingly, brings us full circle in the sense that a couple of years ago when we had our first really riveting conversation about death, it was principally around MAID. And so let's end with that. So we'll offer some responses, perhaps.
I'm all in favor of it. I have watched people close to me and far from me who have known that dementia was coming, and dementia is gruesome. It is the long goodbye. The law can't be passed quickly enough for me and for people in families where dementia runs rife. And when it starts, the signs are, in the case where the signs are clear, I think this opens up another option in the toolkit rather than putting the entire family through the suffering that's going to come. When I eulogized my father, I said, my father did not suffer from dementia. We did.
Thanks. Deanna?
I don't know how one responds to that in under a minute, actually. I would like to say that part of the philosophical tension about this in palliative care all along has been a fundamental tenet is palliative care neither hastens nor postpones dying. So MAID interrupts that naturalness. And one of the things that I think about is that by being able to decide the day I'm going to die, the growth and the evolution that happens inside a person in that porous time is truncated. That the grace or some of those moments that are memorable forever will not occur. And it doesn't mean it's right or wrong, good or bad, but it does remind us some of that transformation will not happen.
Misha, you get the last word.
I need another hour and a half to talk about that topic. And I think it's really like we cannot decontextualize that from, do people have access or do they not to palliative care? Do they have access or do they not to actually skilled mental health care? Have we taken into account social determinants of health? So like there's just so many. So on one hand, yes, and on the other hand, yes. I see you have another topic coming at some point.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does make me think that given the rapid changes that we've seen in legislation, and I think also social attitudes around medical assistance in dying, that would justify another panel or maybe even series of panels, because I think we've just scratched the surface in some respects of that particular question. But the opening up that question creates an opportunity to think about all manner of issues, including the issue I think that Martin raised in his first question about kind of capital R religious resources that might be brought to bear for people in these last moments. But then the question that Peter raised about those who are not of any religious perspective, needing to have some kind of depth in their experience of this final transition of death. And I think the center is a good space to do that. So I think we can all look forward to that in the near future. So please join me in thanking Deanna, Misha, and Peter. Thanks also to Kobe Chance for introducing and being part of the planning phase. Mary Louise Meadow for also being part of that discussion that really helped this occur. And Scott Dolph for really bringing everyone together and really chairing the whole process. And so thanks to all of you on Zoom, as well as those of you who are with us this evening. And on screen right now is a sense of what's happening this Thursday. Actually, normally our lectures are every Thursday at 5, but this was a kind of a rare opportunity to have this special conversation today. So this Thursday at 5, it's online only. So please join us for the Christian contributions to medicine in Hong Kong during World War II. So thanks everybody. Have a safe trip home and see you hopefully Thursday.